Long before the first microscopes revealed the hidden worlds inside a single cell, before double helices spiraled across the pages of modern textbooks, an older story about human origins was already carved into clay. In the cities of ancient Sumer, long vanished beneath the sands of Mesopotamia, scribes pressed wedge-shaped symbols into wet tablets and recorded a claim so audacious that it still echoes across thousands of years. Humanity, they wrote, was created by powerful beings who descended from the heavens, the Anunnaki. To the Sumerians, these were not vague spirits or distant abstractions. They were real, named, ranked, and feared, celestial figures who shaped destinies and, according to some of the oldest surviving texts, shaped human beings themselves. Today, in an age of genetics and evolutionary models, that claim has returned, not as a simple myth, but as a challenge. What if the oldest stories about the gods are entangled somehow with the codes written into our DNA? The modern world is certain of many things. It can sequence genomes, reconstruct evolutionary trees, and trace humanity's journey from small bands of early hominins to a planet-spanning species. Yet beneath this confidence lies a quiet unease. There are moments in the fossil record when change seems to accelerate, when the brain enlarges, language explodes, and symbolic thought erupts with a speed that feels less like a gentle slope and more like a sudden cliff. There are genetic puzzles, stretches of non-coding DNA whose origins and functions remain debated, and signatures in our genetic history that suggest bottlenecks, branching paths, and strange convergences. For most scientists, these are simply the natural complexities of evolution. For others, they are hints, subtle, maddening hints that something else may have brushed against the human story. It is in this uneasy space that the Anunnaki return, no longer confined to museum displays or footnotes in comparative mythology. Researchers outside the mainstream point to Sumerian creation tablets, to the Atrahasis and related texts, which describe gods mixing divine essence with the clay of the earth to fashion a new being capable of labor and understanding. They note how these narratives speak of failed attempts, of prototypes that could not bear the work, of adjustments and corrections made until the ideal form emerged. Read symbolically, these are mythic images of spiritual birth. Read literally, they begin to sound unsettlingly technical, like fragments of an ancient memory translated into the language of ritual and poetry. Could such stories preserve distorted recollections of something akin to genetic engineering, carried in cultural memory long after the details were forgotten? Mainstream geneticists reject this idea. They argue, with powerful evidence, that human DNA bears the marks of deep time, of trial and error, of adaptation under pressure. Our genome is a palimpsest of ancient viruses, environmental challenges, migrations, and survival strategies. There is no need, they say, to invoke visiting gods or cosmic engineers to explain what natural selection already accounts for. Yet some admit, often cautiously, that there are aspects of human consciousness and biological complexity that feel disproportionate to what we might expect from our environmental niche. Why did our cognitive abilities leap so far beyond mere survival needs? Why did we become storytellers, mathematicians, astronomers, metaphysicians? The tension between these views has created one of the most controversial fault lines in the study of human origins. On one side stand those who see myth as metaphor and evolution as sufficient. On the other stand those who treat ancient texts as testimonies, insisting that the earliest civilizations were trying to describe encounters and interventions in the only language they possessed. The Sumerians were not writing science, but they may have been preserving something scientific in symbolic form, encoding fragments of a lost chapter in humanity's genetic history. When they named the Anunnaki as those who, from heaven to earth, came, were they describing gods, or were they struggling to explain beings whose origin lay beyond the familiar sky? Wrapped around this debate is a deeper, more unsettling question. Why do stories of sky beings shaping humanity repeat across cultures that, as far as we know, never communicated with one another? From Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from the Nile to the Indus, myths speak of gods descending, teaching, creating, sometimes even interbreeding. Conventional scholarship explains this through archetypes and shared psychological patterns. Humans everywhere look up, fear the unknown, and imagine it as populated by powers greater than themselves. Alternative thinkers, however, see these parallels as circumstantial evidence of a common, obscured reality. If human DNA is a record of our biological past, could ancient myths be a record of our experiential past, preserving what the genes cannot? The disagreement among scientists, historians, and investigators is not merely technical, it is philosophical. If human beings are the outcome of blind evolutionary processes alone, then our meaning is one we write for ourselves, emerging from a universe indifferent to our existence. If, however, there was intervention, whether by non-human intelligences, advanced terrestrial survivors of an earlier epoch, or something even stranger, then our story is neither accidental nor fully understood. The stakes of the debate rise accordingly. This is not just about how we got here. It is about who we are and whether our potential has already been touched by hands that do not belong to us. Some argue that even entertaining such possibilities is a distraction, a temptation to abandon rigorous inquiry for seductive narratives. Others counter that refusing to ask uncomfortable questions is itself unscientific, especially when both our oldest written records and our most advanced biological tools hint at gaps, jumps, and anomalies. Between these positions stretches a landscape of uncertainty filled with data points, tablets, bones, and base pairs, all waiting to be assembled into a coherent picture. For now, there is no consensus, only competing stories layered over the same mysterious facts. And so we stand at a threshold. On one side lies the familiar narrative of human evolution, on the other, a labyrinth of myths, inscriptions, and alternative readings of our genetic code. The Anunnaki sit at the center of this crossroads, their shadow falling across both clay and chromosome. To move forward, we must not only revisit the ancient texts themselves, but also examine the scientific disagreements that surround our DNA with the same unflinching curiosity. For the real question is no longer simply whether the Anunnaki existed, but whether their echo is still hidden within us, in places we have only begun to explore. The closing questions of the previous block linger like dust suspended in an ancient archive, urging us to look deeper into the origins of the mystery itself. To understand why scientists remain so profoundly divided over the possibility of an Anunnaki connection to human DNA, we must examine the premise at the heart of this debate, the belief, preserved by the world's first civilization, that humanity was intentionally shaped by beings who did not originate on Earth. This premise is not a modern invention, nor the product of recent speculation. It originates in the earliest written texts known to human history, Sumerian cuneiform tablets, whose authors insisted that they were not creating metaphors, but recording memory. Whether that claim reflects literal experience or mythologized truth remains the central question that continues to divide scholars, geneticists, historians, and alternative researchers. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki with astonishing precision. They documented genealogies, ranks, domains, responsibilities, disputes, and interventions. They portrayed these beings not as distant abstractions, but as rulers, teachers, architects of order. Tablets recovered from Nippur, Eridu, and Uruk mention them in administrative lists, ritual instructions, and creation narratives, treating their presence as a matter of public record rather than superstition. What troubles modern scholars is not merely the frequency of these references, but their tone. The texts often read like historical accounts, using language reserved for actual events and individuals. When the scribes wrote of beings who, from the heavens to earth, came, they did not frame the phrase symbolically. They wrote it as if recounting a literal descent. This is where the first layer of disagreement begins. Mainstream historians argue that ancient peoples expressed cosmic truths through stories shaped by culture and imagination. The gods embodied natural forces, psychological archetypes, and social ideals. Yet others argue that the consistency and detail of these accounts, combined with their sudden appearance alongside the earliest writing, suggest they may preserve memories of encounters with advanced beings whose origins the Sumerians interpreted through the lens of divine authority. The friction between these interpretations has only sharpened as new discoveries add complexity rather than clarity. The Sumerian creation narratives intensify this debate. The Atrahasis epic and related texts describe the gods convening, consulting, and crafting humans through a mixture of divine essence and earthly clay. Early attempts, the tablets say, failed. Some creations were too weak, some too sterile, some too uncontrollable. Eventually, after adjustments, a successful version of humanity emerged, one capable of labor, communication, and obedience. To many scholars, these passages are metaphorical representations of humanity's spiritual emergence. But to others, the language, iterative, technical, procedural, resembles something far more scientific. They see echoes of genetic manipulation, hybridization, or guided evolution. Whether this resemblance is coincidence or evidence is the point on which the debate hinges. The figure of Enki, the god associated with wisdom, knowledge, and the mysterious depths, sits at the center of this tension. Sumerian texts portray him not merely as a creator, but as a designer, a problem solver who intervenes directly in the shaping and safeguarding of humanity. He offers warnings, grants knowledge, and challenges the decisions of other gods when he believes they threaten balance. In certain narratives, he provides instructions that read almost like protocols. If interpreted literally, these passages could be taken as records of an individual possessing advanced knowledge of life sciences. If interpreted symbolically, they form a moral drama about responsibility and rebellion. Both possibilities carry implications that continue to fuel disagreement. Scientific perspectives complicate the picture further. Human DNA is a complex archive of evolutionary history, containing ancient viruses, silent sequences, mutations, and patterns shaped by survival. Geneticists emphasize that the genome overwhelmingly supports natural evolution. Yet even among mainstream researchers, there is acknowledgement of sudden cognitive leaps, unexplained expansions in brain capacity, and developmental transitions that appear unusually abrupt. These are the very gaps alternative researchers latch onto, arguing that they may represent phases of intervention or acceleration hinted at in ancient texts. The tension becomes not a clash between myth and science, but a clash between competing interpretations of the same anomalies. Language adds another dimension. The Sumerian language appears in the archaeological record fully formed, with grammar, structure, and vocabulary already complex. Unlike other early languages, it has no identifiable precursor. It does not belong to any known language family. Linguists classify it as an isolate, meaning it stands alone. Some explain this isolation as the result of lost records or incomplete discoveries. Others see in it a sign of sudden cultural insertion, as though knowledge arrived rather than evolved. This linguistic anomaly reinforces the Sumerian claim that their civilization, and by extension, their knowledge, originated with the gods. The rapid rise of Sumerian civilization adds another layer to the premise. Within a short span, humanity leapt from scattered, simple settlements to cities with monumental architecture, legal systems, mathematics, astronomy, and organized religion. Some historians argue this acceleration was the natural outcome of agriculture, combined with geographic advantage. Others find the speed startling, especially given the lack of clear developmental stages. To those exploring the Anunnaki hypothesis, this sudden emergence aligns with the idea of outside influence. To critics, it is simply a testament to human adaptability. What makes the premise so difficult to dismiss or to accept is that both sides rely on compelling arguments. The Sumerians insist they were taught. Science insists humanity evolved naturally, but neither explanation fully accounts for the anomalies, inconsistencies, and sudden leaps embedded in the historical and genetic record. The disagreement persists not because one side is necessarily wrong, but because both are incomplete. And so we stand before the central premise, neither fully myth nor fully science, suspended between clay tablets that speak of celestial teachers and DNA strands that speak of ancient mysteries. As we prepare to move deeper into the world that birthed these stories, the questions only sharpen. What exactly did the Sumerians witness, remember, or imagine? And why does the science of human origins still struggle to dismiss them entirely? The last block left us standing at the edge of a civilization that claimed to have been shaped not by chance, but by celestial intention. To understand why this idea has survived for thousands of years, and why scientists still argue over its implications, we must step into the world the Sumerians themselves inhabited. This world was not an abstract backdrop for myth. It was a physical, living landscape where the rhythms of nature, the architecture of cities, and the order of society all reflected a cosmology rooted in memory rather than imagination. What emerges as we explore this terrain is not merely a setting, but a stage upon which the earliest chapters of humanity's identity were written. Mesopotamia, the cradle of Sumer, was a land defined by extremes. Endless plains stretched beneath a sky of burning light, while two powerful rivers carved life into the dust. The Tigris and Euphrates brought both destruction and abundance, shaping a world where survival depended on knowledge, coordination, and foresight. It was here, on this unpredictable frontier, that the first great cities rose seemingly from nowhere. At first glance, their emergence appears miraculous, yet to those who lived then, it was simply the unfolding of a destiny established long before human memory could record it. The Sumerians believed their cities were not founded by human effort alone, but by the Anunnaki, whose presence anchored civilization itself. Archaeological evidence paints a picture of rapid urban development. Eridu, often called the first city, materialized with a level of sophistication that leaves experts conflicted. Its earliest layers reveal planned temples, organized districts, and advanced water channels, as if engineered according to instructions, rather than trial and error. The Sumerians described Eridu as the sacred dwelling of Enki, the god of wisdom and creation. Whether this association is symbolic or literal, it marks the beginning of a pattern. Every major city claimed origin through partnership with a divine figure. To modernize, these claims appear mythic, but to the Sumerians, they were declarations of lineage, connecting their society to beings they considered foundational to existence. As Sumer expanded, cities like Uruk and Lagash grew into centers of influence, each with monumental structures that defy expectations for their time. The ziggurat, a terraced, towering temple, became the architectural signature of the region. These structures were not merely religious, they embodied the belief that the boundary between earth and sky was permeable, a place where the divine could descend and humanity could ascend through ritual and devotion. Their construction required mathematical understanding, labor organization, and engineering knowledge unusual for early civilizations. Scholars debate whether these achievements reflect lost developmental stages or extraordinary bursts of innovation. Those who consider the Anunnaki narrative take them as potential evidence of external instruction. Daily life in Sumer was infused with cosmic order. Calendars aligned with celestial cycles dictated agriculture, trade, and ritual observances. Temples doubled as administrative hubs where resources were measured, stored, and distributed with a precision that foreshadows modern bureaucracy. Scribes documented everything, from grain yields to astronomical events, preserving a record of daily life that blends the mundane with the divine. In these archives, the Anunnaki appear not as distant gods, but as overseers whose presence shaped social and economic structure. King lists, ritual directives, and city histories all trace their legitimacy to these celestial beings, reinforcing the belief that humanity was part of a larger, orchestrated plan. The environment itself contributed to the worldview that took hold. Seasonal floods transformed barren expanses into fertile crescents, reinforcing the idea that creation emerged from chaos. Harsh summers and unpredictable storms made survival feel like a negotiation between human effort and divine will. In this landscape, myth and reality were not separate domains, but reflections of one another. When the Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki descending from the heavens, they were not describing an abstract realm. They were describing the sky that loomed above them every day. A vast expanse they believed was home to forces capable of influencing Earth directly. Trade routes extended Sumer's influence outward, connecting it to distant cultures. Goods flowed along the rivers and across desert trails, but ideas flowed even faster. With each exchange came opportunities for cultural fusion, yet the core Sumerian worldview remained unshaken. Their sense of identity was anchored not in geography, but in cosmology. They believed that their knowledge, architecture, agriculture, writing, astronomy, was inherited, not invented. Whether this belief reflects truth or tradition, it influenced every aspect of their civilization, shaping a cultural memory that would echo across millennia. The Sumerian language, isolated and enigmatic, deepens this mystery. Its structure reveals a complexity uncommon for the earliest stages of writing. Linguists struggle to place it within any known family, leading some to speculate that it emerged fully formed, like an encoded system introduced rather than evolved. This unusual linguistic profile reinforces the impression of a civilization that began not tentatively, but with confidence. If the Sumerians were truly the first to write, their mastery of the medium is astonishing. If they inherited writing, the question becomes, from whom? As we walk deeper into the landscape of early Sumer, the world begins to feel both familiar and alien. Familiar because we recognize patterns of human behavior, ambition, worship, survival. Alien because of the speed, sophistication, and self-awareness with which this society emerged. Every artifact, every inscription, every architectural layer seems to whisper the same message. Something extraordinary happened here. Whether that something was human ingenuity accelerated by environmental opportunity or the influence of beings remembered as the Anunnaki remains the heart of the debate. And it is here, within this richly textured world, that the first undeniable contradictions begin to surface. Contradictions that will deepen the mystery and propel us toward the next stage of the inquiry, where the anomalies of the ancient world refuse to be ignored. The world of early Sumer, with its shimmering plains and sky-bound temples, leaves behind an impression of coherence so strong that the first genuine fracture in the narrative feels almost shocking. Until now, the story appears unified. The Sumerians believed they were taught by celestial beings. Archaeology reveals rapid technological and cultural development, and myth blends seamlessly with daily life. But as we examine the record more closely, the smooth surface begins to crack. In these cracks we find the earliest contradiction, an anomaly so profound that it still divides scholars, fuels alternative theories, and challenges the foundations of both science and myth. It begins with a single claim repeated across tablets, hymns, king lists, and ritual texts. Humanity was created suddenly, intentionally, and under the direction of the Anunnaki. This claim stands in open conflict with the slow, incremental progression described by evolutionary biology. And it is here, between these two irreconcilable stories, that the debate sharpens into its most unsettling form. The Sumerian version of human origins is precise. The gods gather, the lesser deities labor. A rebellion breaks out, the higher gods intervene. A solution is proposed. A being must be created to take on the burden of work. What follows in the Atrahasis epic and related texts is a sequence of creation attempts described with a detail that seems almost procedural. Some early creations fail, others do not meet expectations. Eventually, through a process of adjustment, the final model emerges. Humanity is born, capable of communication, strength, and obedience. The language is symbolic, yes, but also strangely systematic, filled with steps, corrections, debates, and outcomes. It is this procedural quality that draws the attention of modern theorists who argue that these narratives resemble primitive descriptions of experimentation, biological, genetic, or something even more advanced. Critics counter that myth often uses metaphorical sequences to explain cosmic truths, but even they acknowledge that the level of detail is unusual, as if the story preserves fragments of an older tradition whose meaning has been obscured. The contradiction deepens when we turn to modern genetics. The human genome tells a story of long evolutionary pathways, shaped by mutation, selection, and adaptation. Yet embedded within that story are abrupt transitions that defy easy explanation. The rapid expansion of the cerebral cortex, the sudden appearance of symbolic behavior, the extraordinary linguistic capacity, these developments occur with a speed that stands out when compared to the slow evolutionary changes observed in other species. Some geneticists point to environmental pressures as possible catalysts. Others note that our DNA contains segments whose function remains unknown, patterns that could be remnants of ancient viral integrations or mysterious genomic shifts. And while the consensus overwhelmingly favors natural evolution, it does not erase the questions that linger at the edges. These unexplained leaps provide fuel for those who say the Sumerian creation stories may reflect literal interventions, moments when human biology was accelerated or influenced by beings whose knowledge surpassed our own. Archaeology adds another layer to the disagreement. Early Sumerian cities appear with levels of organization that seem disproportionate to their age. Complex irrigation, legal systems, astronomical records, standardized measurements, these elements emerge in tight chronological proximity, as if woven together by design rather than discovered independently over long periods. Mainstream historians attribute this rapid sophistication to cultural convergence and environmental necessity, but skeptics argue that the developmental curve is too steep, the innovations too synchronized. They see in these archaeological layers the echo of the same suddenness described in the creation narratives, a civilization that appears not gradually, but fully awakened. Whether this reflects human ingenuity under unique conditions or the influence of external guidance is precisely where interpretation diverges. The Sumerian king list widens the fracture further. It describes rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years before the flood, lifespans far beyond any biological possibility. These numbers are often labeled symbolic or ceremonial. Yet the consistency of the figures across multiple copies of the list raises questions. Why use such specific measurements if they were not meant to convey significance? Why maintain them across centuries? Alternative scholars argue that these long reigns reflect memories of beings whose lifespans exceeded human norms, perhaps due to advanced biology, technology, or a non-terrestrial origin. Traditional scholars insist such claims are allegorical, representing eras rather than individuals, but the list refuses to fit neatly into either interpretation, lingering as a puzzle without resolution. As we delve deeper, we encounter contradictions within the myths themselves. The gods are described as powerful, yet vulnerable, wise, yet divided, immortal in some contexts, finite in others. They engage in debates, disagreements, and compromises. They show emotion, anger, fear, compassion, regret. These traits make them relatable, but they also raise questions about their nature. If the Anunnaki were symbolic, why depict them with such human complexity? If they were literal, what explains their limitations? The myths present beings who are neither fully divine nor entirely mortal, occupying a space that defies categorical understanding. This ambiguity complicates every attempt to decipher the stories, feeding both skepticism and fascination. The contradiction becomes most acute when we place these ancient accounts beside modern scientific certainty. On one side stands the evolutionary model, slow, natural, incremental, governed by the logic of survival. On the other side stands the Sumerian narrative, sudden, intentional, crafted by design. The two stories are not easily reconciled, and yet the archaeological record, genetic evidence, and linguistic anomalies do not align perfectly with either perspective. Instead, they form a landscape of competing clues, each pointing in a slightly different direction. Some support evolution, some echo the myths. Some resist explanation altogether. It is within this unresolved tension that the mystery thrives. Scholars attempt to draw clear boundaries. Researchers try to silence the inconsistencies. But the contradictions endure, embedded in our oldest texts, our earliest ruins, and our very biology. They compel us to ask whether the truth of human origins lies not in choosing one narrative over the other, but in exploring the possibility that both contain pieces of a larger, forgotten story. And as this contradiction settles like a disturbance beneath ancient sands, it reveals a shadow stretching toward the next chapter, where the physical evidence of the ancient world will speak more loudly, and the investigation will carry us deeper into the heart of the enigma. The fracture revealed in the previous block opens into a deeper void, one filled not with artifacts or measurements, but with cosmology itself, the great framework through which the Sumerians understood existence. If we are to grasp why their narratives about creation, purpose, and celestial intervention survived with such persistence, we must step into the mythological architecture that shaped their world. This is not the territory of simple fables or decorative legends. For the Sumerians, mythology was the operating system of reality, the structure upon which both society and self were built. And at the center of this vast system stood the Anunnaki, not as distant omens in the sky, but as governors of a universe arranged with mathematical precision. To the Sumerians, the cosmos was not a chaotic expanse of random stars. It was a carefully layered realm governed by law, hierarchy, and intention. At the highest level reigned An, the sovereign of the heavens, whose authority extended across constellations and celestial halls. Beneath him stood Enlil, the force of command and breath of life, and Enki, master of the deep waters and keeper of knowledge. Below these principal deities existed a council of divine beings, the Anunnaki, each assigned a role, a place, a domain. They controlled the weather, the earth, fertility, death, rivers, storms, the growth of crops, the rise of kings, and the fate of civilizations. In this cosmology, nothing occurred without purpose. The universe was not random, it was ruled. The Enuma Elish and older Sumerian tablets describe a creation not born from accident, but from conflict, order, and structured command. The primordial waters divide. Forces contend, authority emerges. The cosmos takes shape not as a byproduct, but through intention. The parallels between this ancient narrative and certain principles of modern cosmology are striking, not because the Sumerians understood physics, but because their myths reflect an underlying belief that the universe operates according to design. Whether that design was imposed by gods, by memory, or by imagination is what remains contested, but the structure itself reveals a worldview in which the heavens were populated by beings with agency, reason, and hierarchy. They were not the unreachable abstractions of later religious systems. They were administrators of cosmic law. Humanity's role within this cosmology was both humbling and significant. According to Sumerian belief, humans were created to serve within the cosmic order, not as slaves in the crude sense, but as participants in a grand arrangement. The gods managed the celestial mechanisms. Humans tended the earthly realm. Temples acted as nodes connecting these domains, and rituals served as the maintenance of cosmic harmony. Festivals reenacted the creation, reaffirming the bonds between heaven, earth, and underworld. In this worldview, the Anunnaki were not symbolic characters. They were essential components of a system that required constant balancing, adjusting, and reaffirming. The idea that humans were shaped to serve a purpose became central to Sumerian identity. The stars themselves were woven into this belief. The Sumerians tracked the heavens with a precision that continues to astonish modern astronomers. They identified planets, charted their paths, noted their cycles, and associated them with specific deities. The night sky was not a random glittering canvas. It was a celestial map of divine activity. Temples were aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and stellar risings. Rituals corresponded with lunar phases. Even legal decisions and agricultural plans were determined according to celestial rhythms. Such integration suggests not superstition, but systematization, a cosmic calendar embedded in the rhythm of civilization. This deep astronomical awareness has fueled modern alternative theories, especially those that view the Anunnaki not as metaphysical beings, but as advanced intelligences. To these theorists, the Sumerians encoded celestial origins into their myths because they believed their gods literally descended from the skies. The phrase, "those who from heaven to earth came," gains new significance when placed beside their stellar knowledge. Critics argue that such interpretations overlook the power of symbolic thinking, yet even skeptics acknowledge that the Sumerians treated the heavens not as metaphors, but as regions inhabited by forces with intention. Whether these forces were imagined or remembered remains the heart of the mystery. The complexity of Sumerian cosmology is further revealed in their understanding of divine conflict. The gods argued, conspired, rebelled, reconciled. They operated according to laws, councils, decrees. Their relationships were political as much as spiritual. This human-like complexity has perplexed scholars who struggle to categorize these beings as either abstract ideals or literal entities. If they were metaphors, why give them such consistent genealogies, roles, and personalities across centuries? If they were literal, what does their fallibility imply? The ambiguity is not a flaw. It is a window, a hint that the Sumerians were describing beings who existed in a space between categories, neither wholly divine nor fully mortal, neither purely symbolic nor entirely physical. The role of humanity within this cosmic structure remains the most intriguing aspect. Humans were created, according to the texts, to help maintain balance, but they were also taught agriculture, mathematics, writing, governance, astronomy. This instruction was attributed directly to the Anunnaki, who acted as culture bearers. Whether this reflects symbolic representation of collective human innovation or memories of contact with advanced beings is a question that modern researchers continue to debate with fervor. What complicates the matter is that the Sumerians themselves never claimed ownership of these innovations. They insisted that knowledge was bestowed, not discovered. And so the cosmology becomes more than myth. It becomes a declaration, a record of how the earliest civilization understood its relationship with the universe, a relationship defined by hierarchy, intention, and connection to beings whose presence shaped the origins of humanity itself. Whether this understanding emerges from imagination, tradition, or encounter is the enigma that rests at the center of the Anunnaki debate. As we step beyond this cosmic architecture, the next phase of the investigation leads us not into the heavens, but deeper into the rise of civilization itself, into the inventions, structures, and breakthroughs that transformed humanity in ways that feel both natural and impossibly sudden. The vast cosmology of the Sumerians, with its layered heavens and purposeful creation, fades behind us like a night sky giving way to dawn. What emerges now is a world in motion, a civilization rising with such sudden brilliance that even today, scholars struggle to explain its velocity. If the previous block revealed the system of divine order that shaped Sumerian identity, this one brings us into the living engine of that order, the rise of civilization itself. Here, in the fertile arc between the Tigris and Euphrates, humanity's potential ignited in ways that feel breathtakingly swift, as though responding not merely to environmental opportunity, but to some deeper, unseen catalyst. Whether that catalyst was human ingenuity, divine instruction, extraterrestrial intervention, or a convergence of all three is the question that continues to divide scientific circles and alternative researchers alike. The first cities of Sumer did not unfold slowly like seeds sprouting into villages. They appeared almost explosively, with levels of sophistication that defy their age. Eridu, regarded as the earliest city, emerges with planned structures, organized districts, and a temple that undergoes 17 architectural phases, all within a span that suggests extraordinary coordination. Each reconstruction of the temple was larger, more elaborate, more aligned with celestial patterns, as if responding to a blueprint that extended beyond mortal minds. The Sumerians themselves insisted that Eridu was founded by the gods, specifically by Enki, the divine architect of civilization. Whether this reflects historical memory or mythologized tradition, the association hints at how the Sumerians perceived their own awakening, not as a human achievement alone, but as the beginning of a partnership. Uruk, rising shortly after, transformed this awakening into a phenomenon. At its height, it was one of the largest urban centers on Earth, boasting monumental temples, administrative complexes, and a population that rivaled later empires. The Iana precinct, dedicated to Inanna, stood as a testament to engineering skill far beyond what archaeologists once assumed possible for that era. Beneath its floors, tablets reveal administrative systems so organized that they resemble early prototypes of bureaucracy. Resource allocation, trade routes, land distribution, taxation, everything was cataloged with a precision that would not reappear in many parts of the world for millennia. These developments did not evolve gradually. They arrived in clusters, as though introduced into the social fabric rather than discovered through slow experimentation. Agriculture, too, underwent a transformation. The Sumerians pioneered irrigation on a scale previously unseen, constructing canals, levees, and reservoirs that required mathematical planning and collective coordination. Their understanding of water management allowed them to harness the unpredictable floods of the rivers and convert barren land into fertile fields. Surplus food supported specialization, and specialization supported innovation. Yet the speed of this transformation troubles conventional explanations. In many regions, irrigation evolved through centuries of trial and error. In Sumer, it appears with striking completeness, as though guided by specific knowledge of hydrology and seasonal cycles. Writing is perhaps the most astonishing leap. Cuneiform did not begin as crude symbols. Its earliest forms show structured grammar, standardized signs, and specialized vocabulary related to trade, astronomy, agriculture, and governance. This level of complexity suggests not an embryonic experiment, but a functional system introduced for immediate use. The Sumerians treated writing as a divine gift, delivered through the temples, and used to bridge the mortal and cosmic realms. Whether this belief hints at literal instruction or cultural reverence remains contested, but the effect is undeniable. Writing transformed Sumer from a collection of brilliant cities into a civilization capable of transmitting knowledge across generations. Mathematics and astronomy followed similar trajectories. The Sumerians divided circles into 360 degrees, hours into 60 minutes, and minutes into 60 seconds, a system still used today. Their star charts acknowledge planets and constellations with remarkable accuracy. Clay tablets describe celestial cycles, eclipses, and planetary movements with a sophistication that challenges the assumption of primitive observation. Some scholars attribute this precision to careful long-term study. Others note that such calculations require extensive historical data that appears absent in the archaeological record. If the Sumerians inherited this knowledge, who preserved it before them? If they developed it independently, why does it appear fully formed? The rise of metallurgy further deepens the mystery. Evidence indicates the use of alloys that demanded controlled temperatures and specialized techniques. Copper tools, statues, and ceremonial objects show craftsmanship suggesting established metalworking traditions, yet the developmental stages preceding these artifacts remain unclear. The gaps are troubling. Where are the crude prototypes, the failed attempts, the experiments typical of emerging technologies? Their absence suggests either lost archaeological layers or sudden introduction of advanced methods. Even socially, Sumer seemed to leap ahead. The earliest legal codes, predating Hammurabi, reflect an understanding of justice, compensation, and social hierarchy far more sophisticated than expected. These laws reference divine mandate, reinforcing the belief that order descended from the heavens. City-states functioned under a system of kingship believed to originate with the gods. The Sumerian king list explicitly states, when kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Whether symbolic or literal, the phrase anchors political authority to a celestial source, reinforcing the idea that human society did not merely evolve, it was established. Critics argue that human innovation, environmental pressure, and cultural exchange explain Sumer's rapid rise, but even they acknowledge anomalies, missing developmental phases, sudden complexity, linguistic isolation, and architectural mastery. Supporters of alternative theories argue that these anomalies align with Sumerian claims of divine instruction or external influence. They suggest the Anunnaki narrative may be more than myth, perhaps an encoded memory of beings whose interventions accelerated human development. Mainstream scholars reject this possibility, insisting that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Yet neither side can deny the extraordinary nature of Sumer's sudden brilliance. As we move forward, the weight of this paradox becomes impossible to ignore. Whether shaped by natural evolution or cosmic intervention, Sumer's rise set the template for every civilization that followed. Its cities, systems, and symbols echo across time. But beneath this legacy lies an unsettling question. If Sumer awakened so suddenly, with knowledge that seems borrowed from a deeper well, what might that reveal about the forces that shaped humanity itself? And as that question settles, the next stage of our journey begins, where the ruins, inscriptions, and artifacts of this ancient world speak not in mythic language, but in the tangible evidence they left behind. The rise of Sumer, dazzling in its speed and sophistication, leads us inevitably into the physical evidence left behind. The ruins, artifacts, inscriptions, and fragments of material culture that form the archaeological backbone of everything we think we know about the Anunnaki and early humanity. If the previous blocks illuminated the ideology, cosmology, and societal awakening of the ancient world, this one brings us into contact with the clay, stone, metal, and marks that survived long after voices fell silent. It is here, among shattered tablets and weathered temples, that we search for answers. Did the Sumerians invent the stories of celestial creators, or were they documenting something they believed they had seen? The archaeological record does not give us simple resolutions. Instead, it deepens the enigma through an interplay of brilliance, strangeness, and missing pieces that refuse to align neatly with conventional expectations. Excavations across Mesopotamia have revealed an astonishing density of early artifacts. Ancient Eridu offers temple foundations that show 17 successive reconstructions, each more precise than the last, suggesting a continuity of sacred knowledge that archaeologists struggle to trace backward. At Uruk, clay tablets emerge from the earth with inscriptions so sophisticated that they challenge the notion of writing as a slow, human invention. These tablets do not record myth alone. They document administrative systems, inventory lists, astronomical logs, and temple accounts. Their complexity implies not an experimental phase, but a fully operational bureaucracy. And within these same layers, references to the Anunnaki appear casually, as though the presence of celestial beings was as unremarkable to the ancient scribes as recording grain shipments or canal measurements. Among the most intriguing artifacts are cylinder seals, miniature carved stones used like signatures that depict scenes of deities, rituals, stars, and interactions between gods and humans. Some show figures interpreted as the Anunnaki seated upon elaborate thrones, while others depict what appear to be celestial maps or stylized machines whose forms resist easy interpretation. Mainstream scholars view these images as artistic symbolism. Alternative researchers see echoes of advanced technology or encoded cosmological knowledge. Neither interpretation fully accounts for their intricacy or the cultural importance the Sumerians placed upon them. The seals functioned as identity, authority, and memory, tools that compressed vast ideas into tiny images meant to outlast generations. Perhaps the most controversial artifact is a clay tablet catalogued as VA-243, bearing an arrangement of star-like symbols around a large central form. Some alternative theorists claim this represents our solar system in correct proportion, even depicting planets unknown to ancient cultures. Critics counter that the interpretation stretches beyond what the artifact supports, arguing that the symbols are decorative or refer to deities rather than celestial bodies. Yet the debate illustrates a broader dilemma. Sumerian artifacts often contain imagery that seems to straddle the line between symbolic and technical. Their sky-oriented motifs, astronomical precision, and elaborate divine iconography invite interpretations that vary wildly depending on one's assumptions about the capabilities of ancient people. Architecture adds another layer to this complexity. Ziggurats, with their monumental platforms and precise alignments, dominate the landscape of early city-states. Their construction required not only engineering skill but astronomical knowledge. Certain corners align with solstices, and ceremonial stairways point toward specific stars associated with ruling deities. While archaeologists interpret these alignments as religious symbolism, they also reveal an underlying mathematical discipline that seems unusually advanced for the era. The question emerges once more. Did the Sumerians develop this knowledge independently, or were they taught by those they credited with its origin, the Anunnaki? Burial sites and votive statues offer additional clues, though their meaning remains elusive. Some graves contain objects far more ornate than those in neighboring regions, including intricate metallurgy, beads crafted from distant minerals, and figurines whose stylized eyes and elongated forms strike some researchers as suggestive of beings not entirely human. Most scholars see these as artistic exaggerations, symbols of heightened perception or divine embodiment. But their recurrence across multiple sites has encouraged alternative interpretations, especially when paired with Sumerian descriptions of gods possessing radiant, imposing, or unusual appearances. The textual evidence found among these ruins is perhaps the most compelling. Inscriptions from temples, palaces, and libraries reference interactions between humans and the Anunnaki with a tone that suggests lived reality rather than metaphor. Some tablets describe the gods arriving in fiery chariots, others reference voices from the sky, while still others speak of heavenly boats or shining chambers. Mainstream scholars translate these phrases as poetic devices or ritual metaphors, but to those exploring the possibility of advanced beings, such descriptions sound uncannily like attempts to describe unfamiliar technologies in ancient language. The truth remains locked behind interpretation, mythic metaphor on one side, literal memory on the other. Archaeology also reveals what is missing. In many ancient cultures, we find lengthy developmental phases, crude early tools, evolving building methods, and intermediate forms of writing. In Sumer, these stages are fragmentary or absent. Writing appears mature. Architecture appears coordinated. Governance appears established. Astronomy appears systematic. Where, some ask, are the primitive beginnings? Were they lost, or were they never there? The absence itself becomes an artifact, one that challenges the linear progression favored by mainstream history. Yet even as the physical evidence fuels alternative theories, it simultaneously supports conventional explanations. Irrigation canals, standardized bricks, administrative tools, domestic artifacts, all testify to human ingenuity under pressure, to adaptation in a challenging environment. These objects speak not of gods descending from the sky, but of communities learning, refining, and expanding. The tension between these interpretations defines the archaeological record of Sumer. It contains both the extraordinary and the ordinary, the anomalous and the expected. By walking through these ruins, we find ourselves caught between two worlds. One is familiar, a civilization rising through human effort, creativity, and necessity. The other is unsettling, a civilization that appears too complete, too coordinated, too aware of cosmic principles for its time. Both images exist in the artifacts, side by side, refusing to collapse neatly into a single narrative. And it is within this unresolved duality that we approach the next dimension of the mystery, the administrative records and lists that attempt to impose order on a world shaped by both humans and gods. The ruins and artifacts of Sumer offer fragments of a forgotten world, but it is in their administrative records, those dense, methodical tablets filled with numbers, inventories, and decrees, that the deepest clues about their origins begin to surface. These documents were never meant to inspire awe. They were the paperwork of civilization, shipments of grain, temple rations, livestock counts, taxation agreements, land divisions, labor orders, ceremonial requirements. And yet, within their dry lines of cuneiform, we encounter patterns that complicate the narrative even more than myth or cosmology. For hidden beneath the surface of accounting and governance lies a worldview in which divine presence was not theoretical but operational. The Sumerians did not merely claim that the Anunnaki shaped humanity. They built entire bureaucratic systems on the assumption that these beings actively supervised their society. The earliest administrative tablets reveal a startling level of organization. They track resources with precision, using standardized measurements and numerical systems based on base 60 mathematics. These systems appear fully functional from the start, suggesting that the intellectual framework behind them arrived ready for use, rather than slowly refined. Mainstream scholars argue that environmental pressures, flood cycles, irrigation demands, and population growth forced Sumerians into administrative innovation, but the speed and completeness of these systems raise questions. How did the world's first civilization conceive of complex accounting, proportional allocation, and long-term planning without earlier developmental stages? The Sumerians answered simply, these systems were gifts, instructions brought by the gods. Among the most intriguing types of records are those that list temple workers, offerings, and rations given to the gods. These tablets methodically account for food, drink, precious metals, incense, and animals designated for specific deities. The amounts are consistent and regulated, implying a structured protocol rather than symbolic devotion. Some tablets describe visits of gods to particular sanctuaries, requiring temporary adjustments in offerings or labor. Others reference journeys of divine statues accompanied by priests and officials, events carried out with ceremonial precision. Whether these entries reflect literal perceptions of divine presence or ritual theatricality, the administrative systems treat the gods as active participants rather than distant concepts. The Sumerian king list adds another layer of perplexity. This document attempts to impose chronological order on the entire history of kingship, yet it begins with reigns lasting thousands of years, punctuated by the line, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood, kingship is lowered from heaven again, and reign lengths gradually shrink to human scales. Scholars interpret the exaggerated numbers as symbolic representations of cosmic ages. But the deliberate structure of the list, its transitions, its consistency across versions, its integration into temple archives, suggests it held deeper meaning for the ancient scribes. To them, kingship was not a human invention. It was a divine institution, descending from the Anunnaki and bestowed upon chosen rulers who served as intermediaries between mortal order and cosmic authority. Records from Nippur, the spiritual center of Sumer, reinforce this viewpoint. Many administrative tablets from this city document rituals overseen by priests who acted as administrators of divine will. Offerings are recorded as if delivered to real recipients. Decrees are described as originating from heavenly councils. Even infrastructure projects, canals, granaries, temple expansions are attributed to divine command. Critics argue that this reflects the ancient habit of embedding religion into governance. But the sheer volume of tablets treating the gods as operational authorities challenges that interpretation. The Sumerians acted as though their civilization functioned under the supervision of beings they considered entirely real. Perhaps the most enigmatic administrative artifacts are lists detailing roles and responsibilities of the Anunnaki. Some tablets categorize gods by rank, domain, and duty, with astonishing bureaucratic clarity. They resemble organizational charts more than mythological poetry. This structured cosmology, gods assigned to winds, waters, stars, lands, and cities, implies a system not unlike administration itself, suggesting either a culture obsessed with order or a genuine attempt to document a hierarchy they believed existed. Why would a civilization invent such detailed cosmic accounting unless it reflected something they experienced or inherited? Then there are tablets cataloging specific instructions attributed to divine figures. Some outline measurements for temples, canal alignments, and agricultural cycles. Others describe rituals that must be performed according to the ancient order, a phrase repeated across centuries. The consistency of these traditions suggests preservation of knowledge rather than creative reinvention. If these instructions were symbolic, their technical precision remains hard to explain. If literal, they hint at systems taught by entities remembered as the Anunnaki. One of the strangest categories of administrative texts concerns birth rituals, purification rites, and ceremonies related to the opening of the mouth, a practice associated with animating statues or enabling divine presence. These rituals often describe processes meant to prepare the vessel, a phrase that resonates curiously with creation narratives involving the shaping of humanity. Though scholars see these as symbolic acts, Alternative researchers argue they reflect echoes of ancient biological concepts reframed through ritual language. As we sift through these administrative archives, a pattern emerges. The Sumerians built their society around a belief not only in gods, but in an organized, structured, and present pantheon. Their tablets document not imagination, but systems, bureaucratic, cosmological, and existential. Whether these systems reflect divine instruction, collective memory, or sophisticated self-organization remains debated. But the documents themselves, mundane as they appear, challenge the modern assumption that ancient mythology belonged solely to the realm of story. For the Sumerians, myth and administration were inseparable, woven into the very mechanisms of civilization. And as these records close their clay pages around us, they guide us toward the human dimension of the mystery. The figures who lived under these gods, served them, defied them, and recorded their presence with trembling hands. In the next block, the focus shifts from systems to individuals, revealing how the ancient world perceived its creators not as distant legends, but as beings who walked among them. The administrative records of Sumer, with their rigid lists and meticulous accounting, reveal a civilization shaped by structure. But to understand the deeper mystery of the Anunnaki and their supposed influence on human origins, we must give attention to the individuals who lived within that structure, those who claimed to meet the gods, hear their commands, receive their punishments, or defy their wills. If the bureaucratic tablets portrayed a world run like a cosmic institution, the personal narratives show a world inhabited by beings whose presence felt immediate, powerful, and profoundly real. These stories pull the Anunnaki out of abstraction and place them in the center of human experience, shaping destinies not just of nations, but of singular lives. The first figures to stand out are the early priest kings, rulers who blurred the line between human and divine authority. Inscriptions describe them as chosen by the gods, guided by visions, strengthened by sacred rituals, and entrusted with tasks meant to maintain cosmic balance. Some claim that the gods spoke directly to them in dreams, others that divine beings appeared within temple sanctuaries, granting instruction or issuing warnings. Mainstream scholars interpret these accounts as symbolic expressions of political legitimacy, but the consistency of these descriptions across centuries reveals that the Sumerians viewed such encounters not as metaphor, but as events woven into the fabric of leadership. Among these early rulers, one name echoes through tablets with a resonance that feels almost human in its vulnerability. Enmerkar of Uruk. Associated with the goddess Inanna, his story describes a ruler who struggles to expand his city and maintain favor with the divine realm. One text recounts a tense exchange between Enmerkar and a distant land, involving a challenge delivered on behalf of the gods. The conflict escalates through spells, rituals, and diplomatic puzzles, culminating in a plea for divine intervention. These stories present the gods not as distant overseers, but as participants, reacting to human ambition with both support and suspicion. Through Enmerkar, we glimpse a person caught between earthly power and celestial expectation, a dynamic that recurs throughout early Sumerian history. Another compelling figure is Lugalbanda, whose tales blend heroism with mystical encounters. In the narratives, he becomes lost in a remote mountain region and is visited by radiant beings described as shining heroes. They grant him guidance and strength, enabling him to return home transformed. Scholars debate whether these figures represent gods, spirits, or symbolic manifestations of inner struggle. Yet the descriptions, light-filled, towering, commanding, mirror the attributes assigned to the Anunnaki in other texts. These stories reveal a pattern. When humans encounter divine beings, they describe effects that feel physical, emotional, and transformative, not merely symbolic. But the most controversial accounts come from texts describing direct interactions between humans and the gods in everyday contexts. Some tablets from temple libraries recount instructions given to priests by divine figures appearing in dreams, speaking through oracles, or manifesting through sacred statues believed to house their presence. These experiences blur the line between psychological interpretation and actual encounter. The Sumerians framed these events with a mixture of reverence and fear, believing that divine proximity brought danger as often as blessing. Their gods were not comforting abstractions. They were unpredictable forces whose nearness could alter the fate of families, cities, or entire regions. Creation narratives offer an even more intimate dimension. Stories of human formation describe the gods debating how best to shape their new beings, considering what traits humans should possess, and assigning each person a fragment of divine essence. In these narratives, humanity is not an afterthought. It is a deliberate, thoughtful project. While modern scholars classify these passages as myth, the Sumerians appear to have taken them literally. People viewed themselves as crafted beings, designed with intention and placed into a world built through layers of divine labor. This belief deeply influenced their sense of self, shaping how they interpreted suffering, success, duty, and mortality. Some individuals claim to witness the aftermath of divine anger. Flood narratives, plagues, and city destructions are often framed as punishments delivered because humans violated cosmic order. In the story of Ziusudra, the Sumerian precursor to Noah, the gods decide to wipe out humanity, only to reverse their decision at the last moment when one deity intervenes to save a single man. Ziusudra survives in a vessel described with curious details, emerging into a transformed world at the command of a god who speaks through the storm. These accounts blend mythic symbolism with descriptions that feel oddly specific, as though drawn from memories passed through generations. Even common individuals appear in personal prayers etched into clay. Some plead for healing, others beg for protection from unseen forces, while a few describe dreams in which gods or watchers appear with messages. These smaller voices show that the divine realm felt accessible to all, not just elites. Whether these experiences reflected inner psychological states or something external remains unknown, but they shaped a worldview in which every person lived beneath the gaze of beings who could alter life with a gesture. These human stories do something the administrative tablets cannot. They reveal emotional texture. They show fear, devotion, longing, awe. They show humanity grappling with forces they could not fully understand, yet believed were intimately involved in their existence. They reveal that the Anunnaki were not distant mythological concepts. They were woven into lives at every level of society. And because of this, the Sumerians preserved their memories with the same seriousness they gave to harvest records and temple inventories. As we step away from these individual stories, a new question crystallizes. If humans truly believed they were shaped, guided, and judged by these beings, what happened when that relationship fractured? The answer lies in moments of crisis, floods, wars, and cosmic upheavals, events that pushed the ancient world to its breaking point and forced humanity to confront truths it could not fully comprehend. The intimate human stories preserved in Sumerian tablets reveal a civilization that believed itself watched, guided, and sometimes judged by beings whose presence felt immediate. Yet beneath these narratives lies a darker thread, one that grows heavier as we move toward the first great turning point in humanity's ancient past. For no civilization that believes itself created by the gods can escape the consequences of disappointing them. The personal devotion and awe reflected in earlier blocks give way to fear, crisis, and escalating tension between mortals and the forces they worshipped. This tension becomes the crucible in which the first moral and existential trauma of the ancient world takes shape, marking a shift from cooperation to conflict and exposing the fragile line between reverence and rebellion. The earliest sign of this shift appears in temple hymns lamenting periods when the gods withdrew their radiance, a phrase scholars interpret as symbolic, but which the Sumerians described as literal. These texts portray moments when divine presence seemed to grow distant, when blessings turned thin and omens turned grim. Crops failed, storms raged without pattern, and political instability rippled through the land. The people interpreted these events as signs that something in the cosmic order had fractured. This belief intensified as rival city-states clashed in battles justified not by territory alone, but by claims of divine mandate. Each city saw itself as the chosen dwelling of a particular god, and conflicts between humans became reflections of conflicts between deities. When Uruk fought Kish, when Lagash clashed with Uma, the wars were framed as disputes between divine patrons. Human suffering became the canvas of celestial disagreement. Amid this growing tension, myths depicting divine dissatisfaction multiplied. Some describe humanity becoming too numerous or too noisy, disturbing the rest of the gods. Others portray humans as failing to follow ritual obligations, prompting divine irritation. The Atrahasis narrative intensifies this tension, presenting a council of gods debating humanity's fate. Their frustrations mount. Humanity, once crafted as helpers, had grown beyond its intended bounds. They multiplied, spread, and demanded attention. What follows is a sequence of escalating punishments, plagues, droughts, and finally the decision to send a flood meant to reset creation entirely. This moment, whether mythic or reflective of real environmental catastrophe, marks the first major moral crisis of the ancient world. The gods who once nurtured humanity now contemplated its annihilation. For the Sumerians, this divine wrath was not metaphorical. It was existential. Their understanding of morality was tied to cosmic obedience. Balance must be maintained, rituals must be observed, and the hierarchy between gods and humans must remain intact. When humanity faltered, the gods responded with overwhelming force. Yet these stories also reveal a complex emotional dimension within the pantheon. Enki, the creator of humanity, appears torn between loyalty to divine decree and compassion for human life. In multiple accounts, he defies the council's decision by warning a chosen individual, Ziusudra, to preserve life. His whispered instructions, delivered through a reed wall, enable humanity's survival. This defiance reveals a moral fracture not only among humans, but within the divine order itself. The beings who shaped the world were no longer united in purpose. The flood myth, in its Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Mesopotamian forms, left a scar on cultural memory. The trauma of survival echoes through laments, rebuilding hymns, and ritual texts, describing the reestablishment of order after catastrophe. The world after the flood was not the world before it. Kingship was lowered from heaven again, implying a break in continuity. Human lifespans in the king list shrink dramatically after the deluge, suggesting a loss of something that once elevated humanity beyond its natural limits. Scholars interpret these shifts as symbolic reflections of societal change. Alternative theorists see echoes of a literal decline, perhaps genetic, perhaps cultural, following a cataclysm that disrupted whatever relationship humanity once had with beings remembered as the Anunnaki. Even within mundane administrative texts, hints of this trauma linger. Records from early post-flood dynasties show abrupt reorganizations, abandoned settlements, and ritual reforms. People rebuilt, but the tone of the tablets shifts from confident partnership to anxious devotion. The gods remain present, but the relationship feels altered, more distant, more conditional. This emotional shift becomes the foundation of later Mesopotamian religion, where fear intertwines with reverence and appeasement becomes central to worship. The moral crisis of this era set the stage for a deeper existential wound. Humanity's dawning awareness that its creators, whether divine or misunderstood beings, could also be its destroyers. This realization reshaped the way people saw themselves. If humans were crafted for a purpose, what happens when that purpose fails? If divine beings could withdraw or punish, were humans ever truly secure? And if knowledge, kingship, and civilization descended from the heavens, could they be taken back just as easily? These questions, haunting and unresolved, carry us into the next phase of the narrative, when humanity, shaken by catastrophe, begins to seek answers beyond its known boundaries, embarking on journeys that will redefine its relationship with both the gods and itself. The trauma of the ancient flood, with its shattering of cosmic order and rupture between gods and humans, left the earliest civilizations with a sense of incompleteness, a lingering suspicion that something essential had been lost. It is from this fractured landscape that the first great journeys emerged, quests driven not by conquest or commerce, but by a desperate need to recover meaning, knowledge, and connection. As cities rebuilt and dynasties rose from the mud of the old world, humanity began to push beyond familiar horizons, compelled by stories of forgotten lands, hidden archives, and the vanished presence of the Anunnaki. These journeys marked the moment when human curiosity first collided with the boundaries of myth, giving rise to explorations that were as spiritual as they were geographical. One of the earliest and most enigmatic of these quests is preserved in the Sumerian tales of Enmerkar, the king of Uruk. His narratives describe not only battles and diplomacy, but a relentless pursuit of a distant land called Arata, a place rich in precious stones, metals, and spiritual power. Enmerkar's messengers cross mountains and deserts to negotiate with Arata's ruler, invoking the authority of Inanna and referencing ancient agreements said to predate the flood. While traditional scholars interpret these stories as reflections of early trade networks, others sense in them an older memory of contact between regions that shared a deeper, perhaps pre-cataclysmic connection. The descriptions of Arata's wealth, its sacred knowledge, and its mysterious origins hint at a civilization that may have preserved traditions lost elsewhere after the Great Catastrophe. But the most profound journey recorded in early texts belongs to Gilgamesh, the semi-legendary king who sought something far more elusive than trade or tribute. Haunted by mortality after the death of his companion Enkidu, Gilgamesh embarks on a quest to find Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the flood. His path leads through tunnels of darkness, across the waters of death, and into the presence of beings who stand between the human and divine worlds. Along the way, he encounters creatures described as guardians forged by the gods, tavern keepers who live at the edge of reality, and ferrymen who navigate boundaries unseen by ordinary mortals. While modern readers interpret these encounters as mythic allegory, their symbolism is striking. The hero seeks answers in a world shaped by beings whose influence once seemed absolute, but now feels distant, fractured, or hidden. In Utnapishtim's tale, Gilgamesh hears the full account of the divine decision to destroy humanity, a truth withheld from ordinary mortals. Utnapishtim reveals that survival came not through obedience, but through a whisper of rebellion from Enki. The lesson is devastating. Even the gods are divided, their purposes unstable. Gilgamesh learns that immortality was a one-time gift, sealed away after the flood. The gods severed something fundamental, limiting the human lifespan and thrusting mortals into a new era defined by uncertainty. This revelation leaves Gilgamesh changed, his quest unresolved, his world expanded yet darkened. His journey, though fictionalized, reflects a deeper cultural memory of seeking truths lost in the chaos of divine withdrawal. Beyond mythic figures, archaeological evidence hints at real journeys undertaken by ancient peoples, searching for resources or sacred sites tied to pre-flood traditions. Some expeditions traveled into the Zagros Mountains, where ancient settlements contain materials not native to Sumer. Others ventured south toward the Persian Gulf, where legends claimed the Anunnaki had once arrived or departed. Inscriptions speak of lands where the gods ascended, regions marked by strange geological features or unexplained ruins. While mainstream scholarship attributes these accounts to early exploration, alternative theorists see them as attempts to trace the physical footprints of beings revered as gods. The open-ended nature of these journeys, their unanswered questions, their hints at hidden knowledge, keeps the debate alive. Trade networks also expanded during this period, yet many routes defy simple economic explanation. Some led to remote regions with little material benefit, but strong mythic resonance. Others followed celestial alignments rather than rivers or mountains, as if designed to mirror pathways in the sky. These patterns raise questions about whether the Sumerians sought more than goods. Perhaps they hoped to reconnect with beings whose presence had faded, or to reclaim teachings they believed were withheld after the flood. Such motivations would explain why so many myths tie distant lands to divine beings, portraying remote regions as homes of gods, heroes, or immortals. As these quests multiplied, humanity began to build a shared map of the world, one shaped by equal parts memory, imagination, and longing. The journeys reveal a civilization searching for reconnection, trying to mend a break in the cosmic order. They expose a psychological wound left by the flood, a collective quest for guidance in a world where the gods no longer walked as openly as they once did. Whether these travels uncovered real remnants of an earlier age or simply deepened the mystery remains unknown, but they mark the moment when humanity began seeking answers beyond its own borders, driven by the suspicion that the truth of its origins lay somewhere just out of reach. And it is precisely at the threshold of these quests that another figure emerges, the keeper of secrets, the witness to the old world, the one who bridges the gap between divine memory and human longing. In the next block, this enigmatic presence steps forward, offering insights that challenge every assumption about the past. The great quests that shaped the early world, journeys driven by longing, loss, and fractured memory, bring us to the figure who stands like a lone pillar between two eras, the keeper of secrets, the witness who survived what others only remembered in fragments. Every ancient civilization preserves some version of this being, an old king who lived beyond the natural span, a sage who knew the forbidden histories, a priest who guarded the remnants of divine knowledge, or a wanderer who returned from the edges of the world speaking truths that defied belief. In Sumer, this role crystallizes most clearly in the person of Utnapishtim, though his story is only one thread in a much older tapestry of witnesses. He becomes the voice of a world that once knew the Anunnaki not as distant names, but as present forces, and the silence that followed their withdrawal. Utnapishtim's tale begins before the flood, when the gods still walked openly among humans. He is portrayed not as a hero or a king seeking greatness, but as a man chosen by a god who defied his own counsel. Enki, moved by compassion or foresight, warns Utnapishtim of the coming catastrophe, instructing him to build a vessel to preserve life. This singular act places him at the intersection of divine rebellion and human salvation, giving him access to knowledge forbidden to others. After the flood, the gods grant him immortality, isolating him at the far edges of the world, neither mortal nor divine, a living repository of memories the new humanity was never meant to possess. His seclusion is not a reward, but a sentence, binding him to truths that could fracture the fragile order rebuilt after the catastrophe. When Gilgamesh reaches Utnapishtim, he finds not a triumphant survivor, but a weary custodian of a story too heavy for a single life. For centuries, he has carried the knowledge of a lost world, the council that debated humanity's fate, the divine technologies or powers that shaped existence before the flood. The moment the gods watched their own creation drown, his account reveals contradictions within the pantheon itself, gods who argued, wavered, regretted. This instability challenges the image of omnipotent beings and instead presents the Anunnaki as entities bound by laws, emotions, and conflicts. Whether these traits reflect myths or memories is the question that has troubled scholars, theologians, and alternative researchers for decades. Yet Utnapishtim is not the only keeper of secrets in the ancient world. In Sumerian temple texts, there are priests said to carry the tablets of destinies, inscriptions attributed directly to the gods. These keepers were tasked with preserving astronomical cycles, agricultural formulas, and sacred rituals believed to contain fragments of divine wisdom. Some tablets describe knowledge so esoteric concerning the heavens, measurements of time, and cosmic structures that they seem more like coded manuals than religious poetry. Their custodians often appear as shadowed figures, unnamed scribes whose duty was to transmit instructions they could not fully interpret. They were conduits rather than authors, vessels shaped to carry information across generations. Other ancient traditions echo this figure in different forms. In the mountains beyond Sumer, legends speak of watchers, luminous beings who observed humanity and recorded its transformations. In Anatolia, myths describe wandering sages who brought forbidden knowledge to early settlements. In the Indus Valley, traditions tell of RSIs who emerged from isolation, holding cosmic truths. Across cultures, these keepers share certain traits: isolation, longevity, contact with beings from the sky or the deep, and the burden of preserving knowledge that does not belong to ordinary humans. Whether these parallels reveal a shared archetype or fragments of a real ancient class of intermediaries is an unresolved question. Archaeological evidence hints at something unusual. In several sites across Mesopotamia, tablets reference the old instructions, guidelines said to predate the flood. These documents often differ in tone from later writings, more technical, more structured, less theological. Some list measurements without explanation, as if copying an older source. Others detail rituals said to originate from when the gods were present. Scholars attribute this to literary tradition, but the sharp stylistic contrast has led some researchers to wonder whether these are echoes of pre-cataclysmic knowledge preserved by a small group of survivors or custodians. Even more puzzling are the king lists of early dynasties, which record rulers with lifespans impossibly long by modern standards. Critics argue these numbers are symbolic, but the pattern, long reigns before the flood, short reigns afterward, suggests a cultural memory of a drastic biological or cosmological shift. If the Anunnaki once interacted directly with humanity, these early kings may have served as intermediaries, beneficiaries of extended longevity or advanced understanding. If not literal, the pattern still reveals an awareness that something fundamental changed during the transition from the old world to the new. The Keeper of Secrets archetype reaches its emotional peak in laments written after the flood, where scribes describe the struggle to preserve knowledge in a world transformed by loss. Some texts mourn the disappearance of the holy ones who guided the people. Others mention paths in the sky no longer traveled, or voices that once taught the rites now silent. These laments reveal not only trauma, but nostalgia, a longing for beings who once shaped the world and then vanished, leaving humanity to rebuild without their guidance. What makes these figures so important is not merely their knowledge, but the implication behind their stories. Humanity once stood closer to forces that have since withdrawn. The Keepers are the last witnesses of that proximity, guardians of a bridge between eras, custodians of secrets too potent for the new age. Their existence, mythic or historical, suggests that something tangible was lost, something that once connected humanity to a deeper understanding of its origins. And as these guardians fade into the margins of history, their silence sets the stage for the next and most devastating chapter. The great cataclysm that reshaped not only the land, but the memory of civilization itself, leaving behind ruins where answers once stood. The silence surrounding the keepers of ancient knowledge becomes the final calm before the world descends into its most devastating transformation. Every civilization carries memory of a moment when the sky darkened, the waters rose, the ground trembled, or fire swept the horizon, an event so overwhelming that it marked the dividing line between mythic prehistory and the fragile beginnings of recorded time. In Mesopotamia, this moment crystallizes as the Great Cataclysm, the upheaval that Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and later traditions describe with a consistency that transcends culture. It was not merely a flood, though flood dominates the surviving texts. It was a collapse of cosmic order, the moment the gods withdrew their protection or turned their power against the world, reshaping both the land and the destiny of humankind. For the Sumerians, the cataclysm was the consequence of a rift between the divine and the human. The Atrahasis tablets portray the gods as divided, struggling with frustration, fear, and internal conflict. Humanity had grown in number beyond what the divine hierarchy intended. Their noise, as one text poetically claims, disturbed the gods' rest. Yet beneath this metaphor lies something darker. The sense that human beings had become unpredictable, difficult to control, perhaps even too aware. Whether read symbolically or literally, the narrative suggests that humans had crossed a threshold that unsettled their creators, and so the council convened, making a decision that would echo across the millennia. Creation would be undone. The early stages of the cataclysm unfold like a sequence of experiments in destruction. First came plagues, targeted and relentless, described with eerie specificity that modern readers struggle to interpret. When that failed to diminish humanity, drought followed, long, engineered, and devastating. But neither calamity accomplished the goal, for Enki repeatedly intervened, undermining the council's decisions and aiding humanity in secret. Only when the council resolved to unleash the flood, a force beyond the reach of Enki's defiance, did the full scale of the cataclysm begin to manifest. The texts speak of storms without pattern, tides rising in impossible rhythms, and winds so violent that even the gods fled to higher realms. The Great Flood in Sumerian tradition is not a natural disaster. It is a deliberate act, executed with precision and finality. Archaeology supports the memory of multiple ancient floods across Mesopotamia, though not all at the same time. Sediment layers reveal catastrophic events between the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, leaving footprints of sudden abandonment followed by rapid resettlement. These layers show debris, crushed dwellings, and abrupt breaks in cultural continuity. Some sites bear scorch marks and signs of seismic activity, suggesting that water was not the only force reshaping the land. While mainstream scholars attribute these changes to regional climate shifts or river unpredictability, alternative interpretations view them as remnants of a global event, perhaps even connected to broader geological or cosmic disturbances. The alignment of flood myths across cultures has fed speculation that the ancient world experienced far more dramatic environmental shifts than conventional timelines acknowledge. The emotional intensity of the cataclysm emerges most vividly in Mesopotamian laments. These poems describe cities swallowed by darkness, temples sinking into mud, and families clinging to rooftops as the waters rose. Scribes speak of the gods weeping as their own creation drowned, leaving humanity trapped between divine sorrow and divine wrath. This emotional duality reinforces the idea that the Anunnaki were not omnipotent beings, but conflicted powers, grappling with a decision they could not reverse. When the storm finally ceased and the waters receded, the survivors faced a world transformed, physically, socially, and spiritually. Utnapishtim's survival narrative offers details that deepen the mystery. His vessel is described with mathematical precision, built according to instructions that read less like mythic metaphor and more like engineering protocol. 7 decks, precise dimensions, flawless ceiling, details that feel oddly technical. His journey through the flood is equally strange. Birds are released in sequence to test the environment, a method echoed in later flood traditions. When he emerges onto dry land, the gods gather not with celebration, but with shock. as though surprised that anything survived their design. Enlil's anger at discovering a human survivor is fierce, suggesting that survival itself challenged the intended finality of the cataclysm. Other cultures preserve parallel accounts with uncanny similarities: rising waters, chosen survivors, divine regret, hidden knowledge preserved in vessels or mountains. These stories are so consistent that scholars attribute them to cultural diffusion, while alternative researchers argue for a shared memory of a global event. Whether literal or symbolic, the convergence demands attention. Something happened, something powerful enough to fracture memory across continents, and strong enough to reset the trajectory of human civilization. What makes the Sumerian account particularly compelling is what follows: the resetting of kingship, the shortening of human lifespans, the disappearance of beings once described as walking among humans. The post-cataclysm world is smaller, humbler, and more fragile, as though a veil had fallen between humanity and the powers that shaped it. Even the gods appear changed, more distant, more fragmented, more cautious. The cataclysm thus becomes the fulcrum of the entire Anunnaki mystery. It marks the end of one age and the beginning of another, the dividing line between the era when gods and humans mingled and the era when gods became stories. As we leave this moment of devastation, another question rises from the ruins. If the cataclysm severed the connection between humans and the Anunnaki, what truths were lost in the transition? And what revelations awaited those who sought to reclaim them in the age that followed? The cataclysm shattered more than cities and landscapes. It fractured knowledge itself, leaving behind a world where memories of the Anunnaki existed only in fragments scattered across rebuilt settlements, half-preserved rituals, and lingering myths. As survivors pieced together new lives, the once clear line between gods and humans faded into obscurity. Yet in this dimming era, something else began to take shape, a desperate attempt to recover what had been lost. The early post-flood generations sought answers with urgency, but every path toward understanding seemed to collapse into silence. Block by block, the thread to the past unraveled until only echoes remained, creating the profound existential void at the heart of humanity's forgotten history. The first sign of this lost connection appears in the abrupt shift in the tone of Sumerian texts. Before the flood, the gods speak often, intervene directly, and engage with humanity in ways that feel immediate. After the flood, divine speech diminishes. Instructions once delivered through visions or personal encounters become ritual formulas recited from memory. Priests perform ceremonies as in the days of old, yet admit in their own inscriptions that the gods no longer reveal themselves as they once did. This growing silence haunted the ancient mind. If the Anunnaki had shaped humanity, why had they withdrawn? Had the flood severed something deeper than life, perhaps a link between human and divine understanding? One of the most revealing examples of this broken connection lies in the fragmented creation traditions preserved after the flood. The detailed, procedural accounts once attributed to the gods become abstracted, condensed into hymns or symbolic metaphors. The practical knowledge embedded in earlier myths, measurements, sequences, debates, fades into generalized statements about divine power. Scholars interpret this as literary evolution, but the pattern resembles cultural amnesia. The more distant the flood became, the more myth replaced memory. The clearer the gods had once been, the more elusive they now seemed. Something that had once been understood was slipping beyond reach. The Sumerians themselves sensed this loss. Many inscriptions describe attempts to restore divine favor, rebuild sacred sites according to ancient blueprints, and recover rituals believed to mirror forgotten cosmic patterns. Yet these reconstructions often failed. Cities once considered eternal were destroyed repeatedly, as though the ancient protective order had vanished. Temples built to the gods' exact specifications produced no sign of divine return. Prophecies grew contradictory, filled with yearning for messages that no longer arrived. Ritual specialists attempted to interpret omens with increasing desperation, but the clarity of earlier ages had faded. The world felt both familiar and fundamentally altered. In this environment of uncertainty, stories emerged of individuals who sought forbidden knowledge, kings, priests, or wanderers who dared to pry into mysteries the gods had concealed. These tales, preserved in scattered tablets, describe quests for lost tablets of destiny, hidden chambers beneath temples, or forgotten wisdom buried in desert ruins. Yet the outcome is always the same. The seeker fails or returns changed, wounded by secrets too vast to comprehend. One fragment tells of a priest who descended into an ancient tunnel beneath Eridu and emerged sleepless for the rest of his life, haunted by visions. Another describes a ruler who attempted to decipher pre-flood inscriptions only to lose his kingdom within a year. Whether symbolic or historical, these stories reflect a culture grappling with the boundaries of knowledge, boundaries that once were open but had now shut tight. Even the gods seemed transformed by the fracture. Texts from the early 2nd millennium BCE show deities losing coherence, merging with others, splitting into multiple forms, or fading from prominence without explanation. The once stable hierarchy of the Anunnaki becomes diffuse, contradictory, and increasingly difficult to reconcile. This theological fragmentation mirrors the cognitive fragmentation of humanity itself. If the gods once appeared unified, their post-flood representations reveal the consequences of their withdrawal. Without direct presence, interpretation replaced memory, and interpretation inevitably diverged. The vision of the cosmos that once appeared ordered now splintered into competing versions. The physical world offered no clarity. Archaeological layers show temples built atop older ruins without understanding the purpose of the foundations beneath. Tools and symbols from earlier eras appear reused out of context, stripped of original meaning. Clay tablets copied across generations exhibit gradual distortions, suggesting that scribes preserved words without grasping their original significance. Knowledge that once flowed through living contact had become static, brittle, and vulnerable to decay. The further humanity moved from the flood, the more the old world became a mythic horizon, visible only from a distance. This unreachable truth haunts the epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero's quest ends in sorrow, not because he lacked strength, but because the knowledge he sought had been sealed away. Even Utnapishtim, who carried the memory of the old world, could offer no path back. His immortality was an exception, not a doorway. Gilgamesh touches the plant of rejuvenation, symbol of the lost knowledge, but loses it to a serpent, a metaphor for truths slipping perpetually beyond human grasp. His defeat is not a failure of heroic will. It is the irreversible consequence of cosmic separation. In later Sumerian laments, the repeated refrain, "We no longer know," becomes almost ritualistic. They mourn forgotten songs, missing formulas, abandoned symbols, and teachings that once came from the mouths of the Shining Ones. The sense of loss becomes an inheritance, passed through generations like a wound that never heals. Humanity remembered enough to know something immeasurable had been lost, but not enough to retrieve it. This is the existential blow at the heart of the Anunnaki mystery. Not merely that humanity may have been shaped by beings beyond understanding, but that the knowledge of this shaping, once vivid and direct, became unreachable. The fracture between worlds could not be repaired, and from this rupture emerged the questions that still haunt us today. As this realization settles, we move toward a new phase, one in which ancient truths are reinterpreted, misunderstood, or transformed into theories that attempt to rebuild the bridge from the fragments that remain. The unreachable truths left in the wake of the cataclysm created a vacuum that later generations tried desperately to fill. And it is in this vacuum that a new kind of interpretation took shape, one that re-examined the gods not as distant creators, but as beings whose identities, origins, and purposes could be questioned. If the world before the flood had presented the Anunnaki as unquestionable authorities, the world after, it began to pull apart their image piece by piece. By the time scribes, priests, and philosophers of later eras revisited the myths, a subtle shift had begun. The gods were no longer accepted simply as gods. They became prototypes, rulers, ancestors, or even powerful visitors whose nature blurred the line between divinity and something far more tangible. This shift is most evident in the way later Mesopotamian texts reorganize the pantheon. Deities who once acted with personal agency are reframed as governors of cosmic functions, almost like officials in a vast celestial administration. An, Enlil, Enki, Inanna. These beings transform from active participants into archetypes governing sky, authority, knowledge, and force. But beneath this symbolic reinterpretation lies a deeper question. Were the Sumerians, perhaps unconsciously, preserving memories of entities who held real positions of power? The procedural nature of earlier myths, debates, councils, assignments of duty, bears an uncanny resemblance to structured hierarchies found in advanced societies. Mainstream scholars point to the tendency of ancient peoples to project their own political structures onto their gods. Yet the intensity and specificity of Sumerian divine organization invite a different possibility. Perhaps their political systems were modeled on something they witnessed rather than imagined. Enlil's role, for example, evolves across time. Initially depicted as a powerful figure who issues commands, judges humanity, and enforces cosmic order, he later becomes an abstract representation of authority. Some texts portray him as stern, distant, almost aloof, while others describe him as authoritarian and unpredictable. This inconsistency puzzles scholars, but alternative researchers see it as evidence of a real, fallible being whose actions were preserved imperfectly through generations. Similarly, Inanna shifts from a dynamic, complex goddess of power and love into a mythic symbol of transformation and war. Enki, once the wise creator who intervened on humanity's behalf, becomes a patron of abstract knowledge. These shifts reveal a pantheon gradually drifting from memory into metaphor, a process that obscures the original identities behind layers of reinterpretation. As the gods became archetypes, their stories took on new dimensions. Myths once recited as historical accounts became philosophical commentaries on power, morality, and destiny. But traces of something older linger in the cracks. The tales mention devices, weapons, and heavenly boats that descend from the sky. They speak of tablets that contain the laws of the universe, carried by beings who seem more like administrators than ethereal spirits. Even sacred rituals reference the shining ones who rose from the great platform, a phrase some scholars dismiss as poetic imagery, while others interpret as recollections of technology translated into myth. The more these narratives are studied, the more they resist simple categorization. This ambiguity is crucial because it hints at a deeper transformation. The deconstruction of the pantheon was also a deconstruction of memory. As generations reinterpreted the stories, the gods slipped from literal beings into symbolic figures. Their conflicts became moral lessons. Their decisions became cosmological metaphors. Their presence, once described in sensory detail, light, sound, proximity, became abstract, distant, theological. The shift reveals less about the gods themselves and more about the changing human relationship to the past. The ancient world remembered something extraordinary, but it no longer knew how to describe it without veering into myth. At the same time, theological debates within Mesopotamia began to expose contradictions within the pantheon. Some gods appeared in multiple forms across cities, each with slight variations in personality or function. Others fused together, as if the scribes could no longer distinguish where one began and another ended. These inconsistencies reveal the strain of preserving a system whose origins had been forgotten. What were once perhaps real figures with distinct identities became overlapping concepts struggling to adapt to cultural evolution. The pantheon became a palimpsest, stories written over stories, memories overwritten by interpretations. Outside Mesopotamia, echoes of similar divine hierarchies emerge. Egyptian Neteru, Ugaritic council gods, Vedic devas. The parallels are striking enough that some researchers suggest a shared underlying structure. Mainstream scholars attribute this to comparable social development, convergent mythology, or universal human psychology. Yet the precision of these parallels, the councils, the ranks, the celestial origins, raises the question of whether they reflect fragmented memories of beings who interacted with early civilizations across different regions. If so, the Sumerian Anunnaki may represent the oldest, clearest imprint of this forgotten era. The reinterpretation of the gods eventually reached a point where their identities became so symbolic that the original narratives could no longer be reconstructed. The beings who once moved through cities, issued commands, and shaped destinies were now philosophical principles. Humanity had reshaped its creators in its own image, transforming them into reflections of social order, natural forces, or psychological archetypes. Whether this transformation preserved or obscured the truth remains the central question, and as the pantheon dissolves into layers of meaning, we move toward the next realm of inquiry, the cosmic mechanisms, the stars, cycles, and celestial patterns that may hold clues to why these beings were remembered as coming from the heavens. The pantheon's slow dissolution into symbolism leaves behind a final lingering question. Why did the Sumerians insist so consistently, so precisely, that their gods came from the heavens? Not the vague heavens of spiritual allegory, but specific regions of the sky mapped with mathematics, linked to star cycles, and integrated into temple architecture. To understand this, we must step into the cosmic mechanics that shaped the ancient worldview. For the Sumerians, the sky was not an abstract dome. It was a structured realm of movement, rhythm, and intention, a celestial system whose patterns revealed messages, warnings, and perhaps the origins of the beings they called Anunnaki. The night sky above Mesopotamia was remarkably clear, offering an unobstructed view of stars that traced slow arcs over the desert. These celestial bodies became the foundation of Sumerian science. They cataloged constellations, identified planetary motions, and tracked cycles with such precision that their calculations still underpin modern timekeeping. The division of the circle into 360 degrees, the use of sexagesimal units, and the ordering of lunar months all originate in these early observations. To mainstream scholars, this system reflects brilliant human innovation. But once we place these achievements beside the myths, a more unsettling possibility emerges. The Sumerians may have believed they were not simply observing the sky, they were remembering it. Texts from temple libraries describe the heavens as a multi-layered realm divided into three great zones. The highest belonged to An, the middle to Enlil, and the lowest to Enki. Each zone corresponded not only to deities, but to specific regions of the sky. The path of the sun, the wanderings of planets, and the seasonal disappearance of constellations all carried divine significance. Astronomical events were not natural phenomena, they were communications. More intriguingly, certain stars were described as gates or stations, places of entry and exit for the gods. Scholars interpret these phrases as poetic or ritualistic, but when we examine the architecture of ziggurats aligned with solstice positions or temples oriented toward heliacal risings, the pattern suggests something more. These structures may have been built to observe, honor, or even replicate celestial trajectories associated with divine descent. The Mul-Apin tablets, among the most sophisticated astronomical texts of the ancient world, present star lists, rising times, and cosmic cycles with precision that implies centuries of prior observation. Yet these tablets appear suddenly, without clear developmental precursors. Their content includes descriptions of paths in the sky and stations of the gods that resemble coordinated celestial mapping. Some references even describe stars traveling irregularly, likely referring to planets whose movements deviate from the fixed background of the constellations. To modern astronomers, these irregularities are easily explained. To ancient observers, they may have symbolized the movement of beings crossing from one realm to another. The Sumerians also viewed time itself as a cosmic mechanism. They tracked great cycles, the precession of the equinoxes, the repetition of eclipses, and long count periods that spanned centuries. Their calendar systems show awareness of patterns that require generations of continuous observation. This longevity raises questions. How did a young civilization acquire such extensive astronomical memory so quickly? Mainstream scholars point to accumulated knowledge from earlier, undocumented cultures. Alternative researchers suggest that this knowledge was taught, delivered by beings with a mastery of the heavens. Even more compelling is the repeated association between the gods and specific celestial bodies. Inanna was linked to Venus, Nergal to Mars, Nana to the moon. These associations extend far beyond simple correlations. Rituals, festivals, and political decisions aligned with each planet's motion. Some tablets describe moments when a star or planet approached, stood still, or returned, using language that blurs the boundary between astronomy and encounter. Were these poetic metaphors, or did certain celestial events inspire memories of divine presence? The line between scientific observation and mythic recollection is razor thin. A few texts push this ambiguity further. References to the boat of heaven, often associated with Inanna, describe a device that shone like daylight and roared like the storm. Scholars interpret these lines as symbolic descriptions of the planet Venus. But the phrasing, motion, sound, illumination, feels strangely mechanical. The same can be said of myths depicting gods rising in whirlwinds or descending with fire. If purely symbolic, they show astonishing sensory detail. If historical memory reframed as myth, they may preserve descriptions of technologies no longer understood by later scribes. The Sumerians believed the gods maintained order by following celestial cycles. When gods broke cosmic law, catastrophe followed. This belief suggests a worldview in which divine and natural order were intertwined, where beings from the heavens operated according to rules embedded in the structure of the universe. If the Anunnaki were literal visitors, the Sumerian cosmology may reflect an attempt to interpret advanced knowledge through the language of stars and seasons. If symbolic, the precision of their cosmic model remains no less extraordinary. Outside Mesopotamia, similar celestial traditions appear. Egyptians aligned temples with Sirius. The Maya built observatories to track Venus. The Indus Valley encoded astronomical ratios in city planning. These parallels may reflect convergent development or shared memories of an older global tradition tied to sky-watching beings. Regardless, the persistence of cosmic architecture across ancient cultures raises the possibility that the heavens were not merely a canvas for mythology, but a key to understanding humanity's earliest relationship with forces beyond Earth. As we sift through these cosmic patterns, one truth becomes clear. Whether literal or symbolic, the Sumerians encoded their memories of the Anunnaki in the sky itself. Stars became archives, cycles became signatures, the cosmos became a map of origins. And with these celestial clues laid out before us, the next question becomes unavoidable. How do modern interpretations of these ancient patterns reshape and challenge our understanding of human history? By the time we reach the modern era, The ancient sky maps, myths, and fractured memories left by the Sumerians have transformed into a field of competing interpretations. What was once the domain of priests and scribes has become a battleground where archaeologists, linguists, geneticists, and alternative researchers debate the origins of humanity with intensity equal to any ancient conflict. If earlier blocks traced how knowledge dissolved into myth, this one explores how that same myth was resurrected, recast through the lenses of modern science, fringe speculation, and unresolved anomalies that refuse to fit neatly within traditional narratives. The past, once sealed beneath layers of flood silt and interpretive caution, has returned to challenge everything we think we know. One of the first modern sparks came from the decipherment of cuneiform in the 19th century. When scholars realized the Sumerians had recorded elaborate creation stories, king lists spanning impossible timeframes, and detailed accounts of gods interacting with mortals, the academic world responded with both fascination and skepticism. Most treated these texts as mythology, valuable for cultural study but irrelevant to literal history. Yet a small group of researchers felt something deeper stirring, an intuition that the consistency of these narratives hinted at memories older than recorded civilization. The idea remained fringe for decades, dismissed as romantic speculation, until an unexpected force entered the debate: modern science. As genetics advanced, researchers uncovered puzzles that complicated the narrative of linear human evolution. Sudden expansions in brain capacity, unexplained bursts of cognitive complexity, and the appearance of symbolic thought all emerged in relatively narrow windows of time. Mainstream scholars explain these leaps through environmental pressure or genetic drift, yet some geneticists admitted that certain transitions seemed abrupt. The discovery of junk DNA, ancient viral insertions, and enigmatic sequences with unknown function added further layers of mystery. For traditional evolutionary theory, these were simply unresolved details. For alternative theorists, they were evidence. If the Sumerians had recorded a story of humanity being shaped or modified, could these genomic anomalies be traces of that intervention? The debate intensified with the rise of comparative mythology. Researchers noticed that Sumerian tales of sky beings, floods, and civilizing gods echoed across continents in Mesoamerican feathered serpents, Indian devas, Egyptian Neteru, and Greek titans. Mainstream academia attributed these parallels to universal psychological patterns, but alternative scholars argued that the similarities were too strong to ignore. How could isolated cultures produce near-identical narratives unless they drew from a common forgotten source? And if the Sumerians preserved the earliest written version, perhaps their account came closest to the original event. Astronomy added more fuel. Evidence emerged that ancient civilizations worldwide possessed advanced knowledge of celestial cycles. The Sumerians recorded planetary motions with remarkable accuracy. The Maya tracked Venus with near-modern precision. Egyptians aligned temples to Sirius and Orion. For centuries, scholars assumed these achievements were products of long-term observation, but questions persisted. How did so many societies develop sophisticated astronomy so early? Why do their sky maps point to similar constellations? And what explains the recurring theme that their gods came from those very regions of the sky? This convergence of genetics, astronomy, and mythology created fertile ground for modern reinterpretations, the most well-known being those that cast the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial visitors. According to this view, the descriptions of beings descending from the heavens are literal, not symbolic. The gods' councils resemble governing bodies. The boats of heaven reflect advanced craft. The creation of humanity echoes genetic manipulation. Critics dismiss these ideas as pseudoscience, arguing that they project modern concepts onto ancient texts. But supporters respond that ancient cultures used metaphor out of necessity. They lacked the vocabulary to describe technology or biology. For them, the myths are distorted memories of encounters with advanced intelligences. Archaeology complicates both perspectives. Excavations reveal advanced early cities, but also clear evidence of human adaptation and innovation. Tools, ceramics, and settlement patterns show continuity rather than sudden replacement. Yet anomalies remain. Structures without clear developmental precursors, artifacts with unexplained symbolism, and sudden leaps in complexity that challenge linear models. The archaeological record neither confirms nor refutes the Anunnaki hypothesis. It hangs suspended between interpretations. Linguistics offers its own enigmas. The Sumerian language stands as an isolate, with no known relatives. Its grammar and structure appear fully formed in the earliest tablets. Scholars argue that languages can emerge and disappear without leaving descendants, but alternative thinkers see in this linguistic isolation a hint of an introduced system, perhaps taught, perhaps inherited from a lost culture. The truth remains buried in gaps that neither camp can fill. Even physics has joined the conversation, albeit unintentionally. The discovery of non-locality, multidimensional models, and the mathematical possibility of advanced civilizations has reframed the debate. Scientists speculate about civilizations millions of years older than ours. Some consider the possibility of directed panspermia or ancient contact. These ideas, once unthinkable, have become legitimate discussion points in astrophysics. Though mainstream researchers stop far short of endorsing the Anunnaki narrative, the scientific landscape has shifted enough that the once dismissed hypothesis no longer feels entirely impossible. As modern reinterpretations spread, they reveal more about humanity than about the ancient gods. They reflect our longing to reconnect with a lost past, our frustration with unanswered questions, and our suspicion that official explanations are incomplete. Whether the Anunnaki were literal beings, misunderstood ancestors, mythic archetypes, or symbolic personifications of human potential, the theories surrounding them expose a cultural yearning to bridge the gap left by the cataclysm. Yet these modern interpretations also raise a final unsettling question. If the ancient texts preserve even fragments of literal memory, why has the physical evidence remained so faint? And could there be scientific explanations, geological, genetic, archaeological, that reconcile myth and science without dismissing either? The search for that balance guides us into the next block, where modern science confronts the anomalies head-on, offering counterweights, challenges, and answers that are as illuminating as they are incomplete. The modern theories that reinterpret the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial visitors or forgotten advanced beings rise with dramatic appeal, but against them stands an equally powerful current, the scientific counterbalance. This is where geology, biology, anthropology, and archaeology step forward not as enemies of myth, but as disciplines committed to measurable reality. And yet, even as they offer explanations grounded in physical evidence, they inadvertently deepen the mystery they hope to dispel. For every theory they challenge, they reveal new anomalies. For every myth they classify as symbolic, they uncover data that feels strangely aligned with ancient accounts. In this tension, a sharper, more nuanced picture begins to emerge, one that neither fully confirms nor fully denies the Anunnaki narrative, but instead reframes it through the lens of disciplines built on careful observation. Geology provides the first anchor point. The idea of a single world-ending flood, central to the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian traditions, conflicts with the scientific understanding of Earth's climatic history. While evidence of massive regional floods exists in Mesopotamia, none suggest a global cataclysm. Instead, geologists identify multiple overlapping events, shifts in river courses, sudden storms, and localized inundations caused by climatic transitions at the end of the last ice age. These events could have been devastating enough to fuel powerful legends without representing global destruction. Yet the recurrence of flood myths across civilizations remains perplexing. Science explains them as independent responses to rising sea levels and dramatic climate shifts. Mythologists argue they stem from a shared ancestral memory. Neither interpretation fully eliminates the possibility that ancient peoples experienced an event whose psychological impact eclipsed its geological scale. Biology contributes its own perspective. Geneticists examining the human genome find no clear evidence of artificial manipulation or sudden insertion of foreign DNA, no unmistakable genetic signature that points to intervention by an advanced species. Evolutionary processes, despite their occasional leaps, follow patterns explained by mutation, selection, and environmental pressure. Critics of the Anunnaki theory point out that humans share more than 98% of their DNA with chimpanzees, strong evidence for natural evolution. Yet even within this framework, puzzles remain. The abrupt growth of the human prefrontal cortex, the unexplained emergence of complex language, and the so-called ghost lineages of hominin DNA, whose origins are still uncertain. Some researchers propose interbreeding with unknown archaic humans. Others suggest entirely natural developmental accelerations. But the gaps, the suddenness, and the absences echo the unease of earlier blocks. Evolution explains much, but not everything. Anthropology brings another dimension. Studies of early societies reveal how rapidly human innovation can accelerate under pressure. The birth of agriculture, the rise of cities, and the formation of writing systems can emerge from convergent evolutionary behavior rather than external influence. Human beings are pattern makers, tool creators, adapters. To many anthropologists, the rise of Sumer fits within this pattern. Environmental stability, fertile lands, and cultural exchange fostered exponential growth. The Anunnaki, they argue, represent narrative embodiments of this transformation, gods credited with teaching skills humanity developed on its own. Yet the abruptness of Sumer's emergence, the lack of clear developmental precursors, and the sophistication of its earliest texts remain anomalies that anthropologists acknowledge but cannot fully reconcile. Archaeology attempts to bridge these gaps with tangible evidence. Excavations confirm that cities like Eridu and Uruk evolved from earlier settlements, not from sudden appearance. Tools, pottery, and structural remains reveal gradual refinement rather than abrupt technological leaps. Critics of the Anunnaki theory point to these layers as proof of natural development. But even archaeologists note inconsistencies, missing transitional phases in writing, sudden architectural standardization, and astronomical knowledge that appears too advanced for the era. While these anomalies do not prove external intervention, they challenge the assumption of uninterrupted human development. In this gray zone, scientific caution meets interpretive possibility. Physics introduces a broader cosmic context. Theories about advanced civilizations, Fermi paradox solutions, and the mathematical possibility of beings millions of years ahead of humanity open conceptual space for scenarios once dismissed as science fiction. Astrobiologists explore panspermia, the idea that life may have been seeded across planets by natural or artificial means. Some models allow for interventionist scenarios, though purely hypothetical. These scientific explorations do not confirm the Anunnaki narrative, but they remove the rigid barriers that once made it unthinkable. The universe, as physics now suggests, is too old, too vast, and too complex to rule out intelligences beyond our comprehension. Linguistics provides another anchor of skepticism. Scholars emphasize that symbolic language often becomes literal over time. Stories of gods descending from the sky, wielding powerful tools, or engineering creation may reflect metaphors understood by ancient audiences but misunderstood by modern readers. Yet linguistic analysis also reveals the persistence of specific motifs: heavenly descent, fiery chariots, shining beings. that appear across distant cultures with uncanny consistency. Are these universal metaphors or fragments of collective memory? Science offers no definitive answer. In recent decades, archaeology and genetics increasingly collaborate, producing groundbreaking insights. They confirm deep human migrations, interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans, and long-forgotten cultural exchanges. These findings reinforce natural evolution, yet also highlight how much remains unknown. Whole chapters of human history are still missing, erased by geological processes or lost before writing began. The absence of evidence is not proof of absence, but neither is it proof of intervention. Despite its caution, science performs an essential role. It grounds the conversation. It reminds us that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that myth must be tested against the measurable world. Yet paradoxically, science cannot fully dissolve the mysteries that gave rise to the Anunnaki narrative. It explains much, but not everything. It closes some doors while leaving others slightly, tantalizingly ajar. And so we arrive at the threshold of the final act, the synthesis. If myth, science, and archaeology each hold fragments of truth, what larger picture emerges when we place them side by side? What does the evidence suggest about humanity's past? And what does it imply about the civilization that may have come before? The scientific counterweights of the previous block settle like dust over an ancient landscape, revealing not a dismissal of the Anunnaki mystery, but a clarification of its contours. As we move into the final act, a new picture begins to emerge, not one that rejects myth nor blindly accepts it, but one that asks a deeper question. What if humanity is the inheritor of knowledge from a civilization now lost to time? A civilization that rose before the flood, before the first cities, before the earliest myths. A civilization whose memory survives only through the distortions of catastrophe, the fragments of oral tradition, and the ambiguous stories carved into clay. In this block, the lost civilization hypothesis rises from the shadows, not as an answer, but as a framework large enough to hold the contradictions that neither myth nor science can resolve alone. The idea of a forgotten epic is not new. Plato spoke of Atlantis, destroyed in a single day and night. Hindu texts describe cycles of ages punctuated by floods and upheavals. Egyptian priests told of earlier dynasties of gods who ruled before humanity. Sumerian tablets list kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years before the deluge. These accounts, scattered across continents, are usually dismissed as metaphor, mythic mythologies representing symbolic ages rather than real societies. But what if they preserve reflexes of an actual period now erased from geological record? A time when knowledge, either developed or received, reached heights that later civilizations could only dimly echo. Archaeology provides uneasy hints. Cave paintings from tens of thousands of years ago display symbolic thought far more advanced than expected. Megalithic structures around the world, Göbekli Tepe, Nabta Playa, Gunung Padang, emerge suddenly with no clear developmental lineage. Some contain astronomical alignments requiring centuries of observation. Others employ engineering techniques absent in surrounding cultures. These sites suggest not a linear ascent, but waves of forgotten innovation. Mainstream scholars explain them through early experimentation and social complexity, yet the abruptness, scale, and sophistication force a deeper question. Were these isolated anomalies or faint footprints of a lost global pattern? Genetics adds another layer. The discovery of ghost populations within human DNA, extinct lineages we never knew existed, reveals that our past is far more complicated than the neat models once proposed. Some genetic branches diverge oddly, as though shaped by unknown circumstances or interactions. These patterns do not prove intervention, but they leave space for possibilities we cannot yet articulate. When placed beside ancient myths describing humanity as crafted or modified by beings of great knowledge, the genealogical complexity feels less like contradiction and more like a puzzle awaiting missing pieces. Cultural parallels deepen the mystery. Why do the earliest civilizations share sudden leaps in agriculture, architecture, mathematics, and astronomy? Why do they all speak of sky beings, divine teachers, or gods who walked among humans? Why are floods and cosmic resets universal, appearing in Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, the Himalayas, Oceania, and Africa? Scholars attribute this to archetypal thinking or the universality of human experience. But alternative researchers argue that the patterns are too specific, too consistent. Perhaps humanity remembers a time when it did not stand alone. The Sumerians themselves spoke not only of gods, but of eras before the gods, periods when knowledge belonged to beings of immense longevity. The Sumerian king list describes pre-flood rulers whose reigns spanned tens of thousands of years. If symbolic, the numbers represent lost ages. If taken literally, they imply the existence of beings with biological or technological advantages beyond our own. Scholars counter that the list is mythic, yet its structure, and its abrupt shift after the flood, suggests a deliberate attempt to preserve memory in the only language available. The list is not random. It is patterned, organized, and purposeful. Languages offer whispers of deeper continuity. Sumerian stands as an isolate. Egyptian emerges with unexpected complexity. Early Sanskrit appears fully formed. These linguistic anomalies are explained through missing records, yet the gap remains. Where are the transitional languages? Where are the prototypes? Could they have been lost in a cataclysm, or did they belong to an older, forgotten tradition? The lost civilization hypothesis does not claim certainty, but it explains the pattern. Civilizations inherit, reinterpret, and mythologize the remains of those who came before. Even mythology itself supports this layered view. Gods described as radiant, powerful, descending from the sky. Could these be the elevated memories of a previous culture, mythologized as divine over time? If an earlier civilization possessed advanced astronomy, architecture, or esoteric knowledge, later societies would have interpreted them through the only lens they had: divinity. Over generations, the humans of that older age may have become the gods of the next, ancestral figures elevated through retelling until their origins blurred into legend. This hypothesis offers a middle path between strict natural evolution and literal extraterrestrial intervention. It does not require gods to be aliens, nor humans to be engineered. Instead, it proposes that humanity may be the heir to cycles of rise and collapse, inheriting fragments of knowledge from predecessors whose identities are now obscured by myth. In this view, the Anunnaki could represent either advanced remnants of an earlier civilization or symbolic embodiments of that forgotten inheritance. Their stories would be the echo of a world washed away by time, preserved imperfectly through the survivors of catastrophe. Yet even this framework raises more questions than it answers. If there was a lost civilization, where is its physical footprint? Why do its traces appear only in fragments? And what role, if any, did these beings play in shaping human DNA or directing the course of early development? These questions point us toward the final block where all threads converge, not in certainty, but in a deeper reflection on what it means to search for origins hidden behind myth, science, and the silence of forgotten ages. The fragments have been laid out: myths of sky beings and floods, scientific puzzles in the genome, archaeological anomalies scattered across continents, and the haunting possibility of a civilization lost to time. Yet even after passing through every layer of the mystery, one truth remains. We stand at the edge of an origin story we cannot fully recover. The Anunnaki, whether gods, culture bearers, ancestors, or misunderstood visitors, occupy a space where myth and science blur, where memory collapses into metaphor, and where human longing reaches beyond the limits of evidence. The final question is not whether they were real, but why the idea of them persists with such power. Why generations continue to search for traces of beings who may have shaped our world or, at the very least, our imagination. Perhaps the persistence itself is meaningful. Human beings are storytellers by nature, driven to seek patterns, causes, and beginnings. When the ancient Sumerians carved their accounts into clay, they were not merely recording events, they were trying to understand their place in a cosmos that felt immense and purposeful. Their narratives of creation, divine councils, and catastrophic floods may reflect distorted memories, symbolic truths, or literal encounters. But regardless of their origin, these stories offered coherence in a world marked by fragility. They provided a framework for meaning, a connection between the mortal and the eternal. And in doing so, they preserved echoes of experiences that might otherwise have vanished entirely. Modern science, for all its precision, has not erased this longing. Evolution, geology, and cosmology explain much, but they do not satisfy the human desire to understand why consciousness arose, why civilization accelerated so quickly, or why ancient cultures seem to inherit knowledge without clear developmental roots. In the gaps between data points, myth reasserts itself, offering narratives that speak to the intuitive sense that humanity's past contains more than survival and adaptation. The Anunnaki hypothesis, whether embraced literally or metaphorically, reflects this instinctive search for a deeper lineage, a lost relationship, or an origin story grander than chance mutation and environmental pressure. Yet true understanding may lie not in choosing between myth and science, but in recognizing that both are attempts to grasp the same mystery. Myth offers symbolic truth, capturing meaning that transcends literal fact. Science offers empirical truth, grounding our understanding in measurable reality. Where they intersect, a richer picture emerges, one where ancient stories serve as cultural memory of real events, filtered through the language of metaphor, ritual, and wonder. Floods happened. Civilizations rose and fell. Knowledge was lost and rediscovered. The humans who lived through these cycles preserved what they could, sometimes faithfully, sometimes creatively. Over time, their memories became stories, and their stories became myths. If there was a lost civilization, or if remnants of early human groups once possessed knowledge that later cultures misunderstood, then the Anunnaki may represent an ancestral shadow, an echo of teachers, rulers, or survivors whose identity blurred into divinity over millennia. If the stories are purely symbolic, they still point to a powerful truth, that humanity sensed its potential long before it understood the mechanics of its own evolution. The gods of old may reflect the inner architecture of human aspiration, the desire to transcend, to create, to explore the sky from which those ancient beings were said to descend. And if the Anunnaki were something more, literal beings who arrived from beyond our world, then their legacy lives not in artifacts or monuments, but in the questions that push humanity forward. Why does our species look upward, dreaming of distant stars? Why do we search for patterns in the genome that hint at origins beyond Earth? Why do we build technologies that mirror the heavenly boats once described in myth? Whether coincidence or echo, the alignment between ancient imagination and modern possibility remains striking. In the end, the Anunnaki may represent the bridge between what we know and what we hope to discover. They stand at the threshold between history and prehistory, between measurable fact and ancestral memory. Their story reminds us that humanity's past is not a closed book, but a vast landscape of missing chapters, erased pages, and buried fragments waiting to be uncovered. And it reminds us that the search for origins is not only about the past, it is about the future. The curiosity that drives us to ask where we came from is the same force that drives us to explore the cosmos, decode the genome, and question the boundaries of our knowledge. We may never know whether the Anunnaki walked the earth, reshaped our DNA, or guided early civilizations, but the mystery compels us to continue seeking. It invites us to hold myth and science together, to approach the unknown with both imagination and discipline, and to recognize that the story of humanity is still unfolding. Somewhere in that unfolding lies the possibility of rediscovering truths as ancient as the first cities and as vast as the stars themselves. And so the journey ends not with certainty, but with awakening, a recognition that the search for our origins is the search for our potential, and that the most powerful secrets are often those that remain just beyond reach, urging us onward into the endless horizon of what we have yet to understand.